We are continuing our deep dive into the Texas Gang Intelligence Database, or just the Texas Gang Database. What we're going to talk about specifically in this video are some timelines for the information being kept in the database and what the process looks like for validation and just sort of the records retention. Now, we are going to do separate videos to address how to find out if you're in the Texas Gang Database, and then how to potentially contest the findings if you are in the Texas Gang Database. So as a general rule, the important timelines that we look at, there's really going to be two different timelines here. There's going to be one for juveniles and one for everybody who is not a juvenile. So for juveniles, we have a much shorter timeline than for everybody else. It's really important to note here that juveniles are considered everybody age 16 or younger. Adults are going to be age 17 or older. That's kind of a confusing part of the law. Sometimes you'll find areas where you have to be 18 to be charged as an adult. Most people think of 18 as that age of majority, but for purposes of this, 16 or younger is a juvenile, and 17 and older is going to be considered an adult. So what does it look like? What are the basic timelines that we're looking at? Well, from the beginning, we have to look at something called records validation, because that could potentially extend the timeline. So if information is entered in the Texas Gang Database for a juvenile, a records validation, records review has to be performed after 2 years. For adults, it has to be performed after 5 years. So what happens is you come up to the review point. There's actually an automated message that's sent by the Texas Gang Database to law enforcement 15 days prior to the expiration of the record, and that causes the review. So what they're going to be looking at during the validation process are all the records that were collected. So think about documents, photographs, court documents, even social media posts, or reviewing current social media for the person that's been entered in there. Now, if it's found that the information in the database is no longer relevant, if it's no longer applicable to this person under Chapter 67 of the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, then the record gets destroyed. It gets removed from the database altogether. And look, to be clear, it's kind of a gray area when it comes to the criteria of what's relevant, what's still applicable in the database. It's all under Chapter 67, but it doesn't list out things like if person X does this, they will no longer be included. So there's a lot of judgment calls that are made by law enforcement and the people that are maintaining these databases. If it's found that the information is applicable still, if it is relevant still, then the law enforcement agency that's reviewing the information in the gang database has the ability to keep it in for an additional 2 years if you're a juvenile, or an additional 5 years if you're an adult. So maximum timeline for the information to be in there for an adult is 10 years. You have your initial 5 years, the validation review, and then potentially another 5 years. If you're a juvenile, the maximum amount of time that the information will be held is 4 years. You have the initial review after 2 years, and then it could be extended for an additional 2 years if that information is still found to be relevant. So remember, the key things are, is it a juvenile or an adult? What are those records looking like? And there is a duty for the government to go back and check on everything. Now, all of this can be found under subchapter D of Chapter 67 of the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, and there are ways to be proactive about it. It's not just the case that the law enforcement agency, the only way to get removed is by expiration of time. But the caveat here, the major caveat, is that if there's incarceration during that time, if you're held in jail, whether you're a juvenile or an adult, that does not count towards the timeline. So let's say we have an adult person who's entered into the database, and at year 3, so we're talking 2 years prior to that first review, that first validation review, they get incarcerated for, say, 2 years, okay? That adds another 2 years on to the actual information retention process, and then they have to wait that additional 2 years for the validation to be conducted. So with that 2 years of incarceration, it would become a total of 7 years before you get your first validation review, and then potentially getting extended for an additional 5 years. So there are things that can cause the timeline to be extended, which are primarily any sort of incarceration in the Texas judicial system. Very, very important to remember, and that applies to both juveniles and adults. Now, we're going to be doing another deep dive in our next videos to go over how do you check if you're in the Texas gang database, and then potentially how do you get that removed. But again, to sum it all up, all right, remember, the maximum amount of time if you're an adult is generally going to be 10 years that you can be kept in there if it's found that the records are still valid and relevant on the first review, or 4 years if you're a juvenile, if at that review period after the 2 years the information is found to be still relevant and it can be kept in the database longer. Again, the caveat there being any incarceration will add more time onto that.